Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. We're going to get going. I'm going to do my thank yous at the beginning so that I don't rush them at the end. So in addition to thanking you all for being here, I'd like to thank the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and particularly Sarah Dopp and Daria DeBazy for helping to make this event possible on the organizational side. I'd like to thank Charles and the Center of Excellence on the Canadian Federation at the IRPP for being part of the event. I'd like to thank my own institute, the Environics Institute for Survey Research, and Michael Adams, who is here, who makes the institute possible. So I'd like to acknowledge them as one of the hosts for today, and thank my panelists for joining us. So we have Emily Nicolas, who's a columnist for Le Devoir and the Montreal Gazette, and as we'll hear many other interventions, especially over the last couple of weeks. And Charles Breton from the Center of Excellence on the Canadian Federation, where he's the executive director. So the format for today is we're going to have a conversation for, I guess, about 50 minutes or so. We'll see how it goes. But then, of course, we will have opportunity to open it up for your questions and continue the discussion in a little more interactive way at the end. So I didn't introduce myself, so I think you probably figured it out. So by process of elimination, I'm Andrew Parkin. I'm the executive director of the Environics Institute for Survey Research. So our challenge today is to have an interesting discussion about what on the surface looked like a very uninteresting election. At least it was in Quebec. It was uninteresting in the sense that it wasn't a surprise. We don't have to explain what went wrong, why the person that people thought would be reelected premier wasn't reelected premier. He was. We don't have to explain why the pollsters got it wrong, because they didn't. But I think there's still a lot to explain in terms of what the election and some of the discussions around the election might be telling us about larger and longer term changes in Quebec society and how those might end up playing out in ways that affect us all. And I think if I had to kind of put my cards on the table early on in this discussion, I think I really have an interest in getting kind of past the point where we are looking at Quebec politics from outside the province where I live, but kind of as a curiosity. There's a tendency to sort of talk about Quebec politics and the Quebec election in the same way we talk about the Brazil election, right? It's kind of interesting. There's some peculiar people running. We're not, we might. Is that a Legault Bolsonaro comparison? No, we're not there yet. It's a little early. But, we're interested, right? But it's somehow happening over there, out there, right? And I think my interest, certainly in organizing this event, was to try to get us a little beyond that so that we can engage with this discussion in ways that are, I think, more appropriate in the sense that in the end, events will play out in a way that will affect us all. So that's just kind of my way of sort of, as I said, putting my cards on the table about my interest in having this discussion. Because I think my point is we followed the election, we were interested in the election, but I'm not sure if we've broken through to engage with kind of some of the issues and the events to quite the extent that we need to. So that's sort of my starting point. But then to get the discussion going with my colleagues, I'm going to kind of ask them to describe in their view what they think happened, or to what extent is it important, or what does it say? So let me explain. I think there's kind of three frames that are competing in my head about the election that we just had. And the first one is just that it just wasn't important at all. And we should be careful about over-interpreting it, because it was a post-pandemic election. people were sort of tired and generally kind of satisfied, but not that interesting. And it's just the government kind of cruised to re-election in exactly the same way that the government in Ontario cruised to re-election. So, so we should be careful about thinking if something means more than it does. There's a completely different interpretation, which is that it was an election of historic importance, mostly because it's the second election where the PQ finished nowhere near either government or opposition. And the second election that was the worst ever, I think, for the Liberal Party, but certainly the second election where the parties in Quebec that dominated the debate for 50 years, federalists, sovereigntists, are just fading away. And so that, from the point of view of people outside Quebec, it's a historic election in a sort of relief sense. It's like, this is great. We don't ever have to talk about a referendum ever again, because there's no way that PQ is coming back from two setbacks like that. So we can turn the page, move on, and celebrate that. And then finally, the third kind of frame that's competing in my head is that it's a historic election, but for completely different reasons, because to push it to the extreme, it's kind of a return to a form of Quebec politics that's less inclusive, that's a bit more inward looking, and that was more characteristic of the period before the Quiet Revolution. So that, yes, there's major transformations going on in Quebec society, but it's not good. And it's not necessarily something anyone should celebrate. Those are really different ways of seeing the same evening. So I'm not sure who wants to, we didn't agree on who was going to.
We didn't talk about that. No.
Start first. Who wants to? You
want to go, Angelique?
Basically, the question is, which one do I pick?
Which one? But or a fourth one. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say like all of the above, in a sense. There is definitely not necessarily this election, but something that's been going on in the last 20 years, which is just a change in electoral cycle, or a political cycle in Quebec, where the Liberals and the Parti Québécois are no longer the dominating forces in the province. Does that mean the sovereignty debate is gone? No, because Québec solidaire is just growing, and Québec solidaire is a sovereignist force. So it just means that the Parti Québécois seems to appear more and more as a generational party, the party of basically the baby boomers. And that now, even when people are still thinking about making Quebec a country, they think about it on a different basis, on a different form, and they're just exploring and putting their energy elsewhere. So basically the nationalist movement being split up between people who are want to make that about Quebec's identity and they are happy with the CAQ, and then people who want to put forward a different political order, let's put it this way, and they're happy with Quebec solidaire because it's about what you want to make with this different country more than it is about just making a country for just the sake of having a country. I think is how I would explain that split. So that's why, to your second question, I mean, that change of cycle between which parties are more important, I think definitely matters. And the kind of coalition that the CAQ and the Quebec side have been putting forward, I do think represent a different generation of Quebec politics, where the left-right spectrum is definitely much more important. And we saw that as well with the emergence of the Conservative Party of Quebec, which is even more to the right, and shows you that it used to be that people would put their left-right differences aside when they were organizing inside a party, because what really mattered was the yes/no question, and that is not the case anymore, to sum it up. And then the second thing I would say is that yes, it feels. I was just digging into that a little bit more in terms of to do a research for a piece. There has been in Quebec a Montreal region divide, just like I think everywhere else in Canada. There's a Montreal versus there's a big city versus rural divide. However, looking at the history, even Maurice Duplessis had more seats in Montreal than François Legault has, and that really surprised me when I looked at that. So the idea that Montreal is more isolated from power than a really, really, really long time. I would have to actually look back if there was ever a Quebec provincial government that gained a majority with so few seats on the island itself. I don't think it's been done before. François Legault took office, and that means so much in terms of what the issues that have been put forward in terms of, identity politics, immigration, language, racism, all the debates that we've been having. The fact that you have a pathway now to a majority without Montreal explains a lot in terms of the actual debates we've been having in the province and the way they play out politically. If you don't need Montreal to win, and then you start speaking differently. Doesn't mean that you hold different values than premiers in other provinces. It just means that it becomes politically rewarded to say certain things in a way that it would be a pitfall in other provinces to do it if you do need, for example, the GTA for you to win a majority. So I think that's one of the big differences as well that's been happening in the last 4 years, is that there is now a political party that has found a pathway to a majority that does not include Montreal. They have 2 ridings on the island. They could win more, but they don't even need those 2 ridings to keep having a majority. So those are expendable ridings, and it shows. It shows so much. So I'll do it for now.
I think what Emily said is important in the sense that, like, as a new kind of this election turning the page on something else, it's more the Montreal aspect than what you were saying, Andrew, because to me, the disappearance of the PQ and even the Liberals to some extent, that was the previous election. Like, it was clear from the previous election, those 4 years, it was clear that the PQ was not coming back. It was clear that the Liberals were somewhat done. So, like, this one, yes, it's a confirmation, but like the really move away from this yes, no, the sovereignty debate and more into like maybe a left, right, or even an identity one. Like that was, to me, like that was the 2018 election. So this one was not new in that sense, but the confrontation maybe is too early to say, but like the Montreal versus the rest of the province really was really cemented with this result. And I'm not sure that this bodes well for the future. And which means that maybe your third, the way you were presenting it, the third way as kind of this new, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen, but it doesn't seem to be good. I think there's definitely some of that. Again, like Emily said, the fact that they probably don't need the Montreal in any way in the future, in a way in the policies that will be put forward. I think that has an impact. But I will also say that this election was also your first option, very much so like the Ontario election, which was people seemed just to be happy with how things were going. And for a majority of Quebecers, that was the reason they voted for the CAQ. It was just on the economy side, things are just going well. Unemployment is very low. Yes, there's a bit of inflation, but it was a bit late in the inflation cycle for it to really matter as much. And that's the main reason most of the people who voted for CAQ was not, again, like electoral studies will maybe contradict me in the future, but the sense was, it was not because of what was said on immigration. It was not because of Bill 21. It was just a general sense that things are going well. So why not just keep going? It was just one mandate too, right? It's not the second, it wasn't the third or the fourth. It just had one mandate. Let's just try them again, see what they do in the next 4 years. I think that was what most, not all, but many Canadians Quebecers were thinking about when they went to the polls, which to some extent was really similar to what Ontarians were thinking. Although the turnout was bigger, it was better than in Ontario, which was hard to beat in terms of low levels.
Yeah, because people actually think that provincial politics is national politics. Yeah. It has an influence on who shows up at the polls.
But when you think about that schism with Montreal, does it mean that Legault's strength, there's a risk of overestimating it? So we all know that in our system, you get a majority of seats, you rarely get a majority of votes. For about a week after every election, the people who care about that discuss it, write an op-ed about the need for proportional representation, and then everyone forgets because they're elected, they're the premier, they have the legitimacy of the premier's office. But is there a sense that now that Legault is essentially governing without Montreal, despite the 2 seats, that he may not be in as strong a position within the province itself that it looks?
There is, I think, a risk of social crisis more than a political crisis. If you have a government that is that much at odds with a certain proportion of the population, it's very much a generational divide. It's a rural urban divide, but it's a generational divide. It's a linguistic divide. And it's a new Quebecers, old Quebecers, francophone, allophone divide. There's all sorts of divides going on, but I'd say I insist on the generational thing because it means it's conflicts that are happening inside families. It's not something that, you have this social group over there that doesn't necessarily agree with you. Well, a lot of it is parents having an argument with their adult kids when they come over during the holidays on things like Bill 21, on things like Bill 96. I think that's very much where it hurts. So despite the fact that you have a very strong majority for the CAQ at the National Assembly, I do think that if there is no regard for the very different opinions that are being expressed in part of the Quebec population, there's more of a social risk there. And it comes, I don't know, maybe the one comparison that I would do is the way people felt in Toronto or certainly in Montreal as well during the Stephen Harper majority years where, yes, I mean, he had the majority and there was nothing you could do about it, but people were unhappy with that in Toronto and it showed in some ways. Now put with that little Montreal spark of liking to protest and spark social movements, and you could have something, I don't know if I'm seeing a 2012 student movement, but I'm seeing something that could really, for example, on the file of the environment, I could see young people, if the CAQ doesn't do anything serious about the environment in the next 4 years, I could see young people decide that they're going to be very serious about mobilization and in a way that creates national and international news. If the François Legault takes a decision on that's unpopular with young people, despite his strong majority, you could have a social crisis there.
And I think young people in Quebec have showed that, university students have showed that if they want to mobilize and protest something, they can very easily do it at a massive scale. But I think one thing that's important to know is that he did win the election without Montreal, and that's one thing. And you could probably do it again in 4 years. But if you want to, like, you're the premier of Quebec. And if you want to bring Quebec to where you want to bring it economically or what, like, you cannot do it without Montreal. It is the engine that gets the province going, right? That's where the economy is happening. So again, we'll see what happens, but there's a difference between winning it, talking about issues that might alienate people in Montreal, and then governing for the next 4 years, where you kind of need to have some people on board in Montreal to bring the province to where you want to bring it. So we'll see how that happens, how he tones it down on some levels, on some of those questions. I mean, again, Bill 96 and Bill 21 are there to stay, but the next steps on those files, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, and the other thing as well that I would add to this is that it's the mayor of Montreal, the mayor of Quebec City, mayor of Longueuil, mayor of Laval. They're all
Sherbrooke, Granby,
they're all much younger, they're all progressive, and they all like each other. They all work as a group now, and they've been pushing for things like climate change adaptation. They've been pushing for, immigration resettlement issues. On the down low, they've been pushing as well for the whole issue of people with outsiders that might get regularized by Ottawa. They're pushing behind the scenes so that it doesn't look like Quebec is opposed to that, if there's Quebec mayors who are pro that. So there's ways in which the real opposition in Quebec might actually come from the municipal level. So the fact that there's that crew of younger, a lot of them women, mayors in office that got elected just last year in our round of municipal election. That also changes the dynamics as well.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
If I'm going to talk about nationalism and Legault's brand of nationalism, I guess, and I think the question is the way that the CAQ has mobilized nationalism in Quebec really any different from what came before? So there's a temptation outside to, again, we're mostly reacting to two pieces of legislation, Bill 21 and 96, but then there's other, statements from ministers and other things. So it looks like it's a form of nationalism that's a little more inward looking than what we may have seen before. Even from the PQ at times, which at times seem to be twisting itself in knots a little bit to emphasize the civic nationalism of their project. Legault seems to not be as uncomfortable, talking about a more, I guess, linguistically or ethnically defined form of nationalism, and prioritizing, a certain traditional type of identity in Quebec, which of course makes people reach for analogies going back to Duplessis and so on. Is this a misinterpretation? Is there anything really new or different about nationalism in Quebec now, let's say, compared to when Pauline Marois was premier or Lucien Bouchard was premier?
I mean, yes, because the goal is not sovereignty. So from the get-go, it's different, but it's not that different from Duplessis. Leaving aside, so the Duplessis era, and I'm sure there are people in the room, and I'm not just speaking about age, but about expertise that know more about Duplessis and Union Nationale than I do. But it's not around the same ideas, right? It's not about, although some might disagree, but it's not about Catholicism. It's about laïcité, it's about the French language. But this idea of being autonomous, more autonomous, which is again asserting some Quebec's autonomy within Canada. That's a new. It's new in this era, but it goes back to Duplessis for sure. And François Legault himself is really clear that he's done with referendums. Although he doesn't say that he's never gonna, he doesn't say if he would vote yes or no if there was one, but he says it's a hypothetical question he's not going to answer, but he's definitely not, he's not going to do a referendum. Like he's not like a closet separatist. He's done with that. But he's also clearly says, I'm not a federalist, because for him being a federalist is the status quo, and he's not satisfied with that. So again, what shape or form more autonomy for Quebec will take in the future? Now he wants a bit more power over immigration. That's the one he's talked about the most during the election. I don't know what else after that. Part of it is just electoral strategy. I think there's a sweet spot there in Quebec where people are tired of the sovereignty debate. We see it with the fate of the PQ, but hearing that Quebec could be more autonomous, that sounds good. Like, we don't know what that means in reality, but that sounds good. So I think there's a bit of it that's just electorally motivated. But it is a different posture. It's not the posture of the PQ. It's not the posture of the Liberal Party under Philippe Couillard. It's not even the posture that the ADQ had under Dumont, which was also a bit more to the right economically. So it is in that sense, at least for this era, a new posture. Remains to be seen in reality, what will that mean? Like, that's still somewhat unclear to me.
I'll take a different approach to this answer. Maybe it's going to sound, I don't know, more instinctive, but it's really interesting to look into François Legault's own biography, like who he is as a person. He's actually a person from the West Island of Montreal. He's like a premier that, as we were saying, governs without Montreal, but he's actually a Montrealer. Grew up in the West Island, not bilingual. Founded one of the biggest airplane companies, airways in Canada. He's the founder of Air Transat. So like this, it's like the story of the, you know, French Canadian guy in the West Island who had rough relationship with his mostly English neighbors. Some would say has some resentment with that, became a big business person, and seems to always have maybe a chip on his shoulder in terms of trying to prove that French Canadians can do it just as well as Ontarians. Like he's always talking about Ontario and how like the unemployment levels are better in Quebec than in Ontario. It seems to be like for him to express pride in Quebec is to be like, we can do just as well or even better than those English people over there. Seems to be like the subtext of a lot of like his speeches. And so I think there's lots of ways that we can take this conversation on nationalism, but I think it's important to just maybe put that out there, that like his eyes sparkle when he can find the stats in which like Quebec is doing better than Ontario. It's more than just, you know, accounting stuff. It's really his soul is coming out when he talks about those things. And I think it explains a lot of those dynamics like that French Canadian insecurity that is still felt differently by, once again, that's can still be felt everywhere, but it's also a generational phenomenon. And that, you know, when he wants to do something that is about making Quebec different, and then there's a reaction from it that comes from English Canada, it kind of like feels into that trauma / insecurity of like, no, but we can do just as well, and we can be different, and we can be proud of being different. And that, I feel like, beyond the actual issue, I feel like that's the psychology behind it. And I think it's just worth putting it out there. So now it's expressing itself with, you know, secularism bill, language bill, but the point beyond those are basically just ways to make the point that like French Canadians are able and as great as anyone else, which is a point that you do not need to make if you actually believe in yourself, right? So once again, it's a generational thing. And that's what you see play out even federally with François Blanchet, with the Bloc Québécois, when he's like, how dare you call us, you know, like inferior, insecure, racist? Like that's a thing that really resonates with a certain generation of voters. And François Legault, in his speeches, is always tapping into that. So when he's saying we are gonna, I don't know, not have many more immigrants because it would be suicidal for the French nation to have more than 50,000 people coming into Quebec, he's tapping into a deep insecurity that certain French Canadians have when it comes to being invaded and like over, like, so that's what he's doing. So yes, there's the actual policies, but then there are the words, and sometimes the words are not necessarily connected with actual policies. And I think it's important to pay attention to the words and why they resonate socially and politically with his base. And I think he's very aware of what he's doing. And when you are in the, you know, the locker room, the conversation that French Canadians have between themselves, you hear that kind of stuff all the time. And he's so good at just hinting that he's just like saying out loud what everybody's saying in their living rooms, and then just backtracking a little bit because it's like, well, I can't say that because I'm going to be called out by all those woke people. So I'm not going to say that anymore. But like wink, wink, right? So there's been a lot of dog whistle like that happening over the campaign. And that is absolutely playing into a specific base, but it's coming from a specific historic experience of feeling, you know, that gap that used to exist between English and French Canadians. Like that's the origin of the psychology that he's tapping into.
I'm going to get back to that sort of feeling of insecurity in a sec, but I'm wondering if it's possible to untangle these two parts of nationalism, because one of them is the autonomy side, right? Mm-hmm. Just mettre chez nous. Well, we can run our immigration policy, we can run our climate change policy, we can, and so on. And so, to a certain extent, if you're a centralizing Anglo-Canadian, there's a certain threat of that discourse to your vision of the country. But it's a classic division of powers type of discussion. And then there's the other side of nationalism that Legault talks about. That's a values nationalism, right? That we are different. We have a consensus around a different set of values. And it's that part that I hear him pushing more. I don't find the autonomous side to be very different from Dumont or, you know, Bourassa, even in some moods, right? But I don't remember other premiers talking so much about values.
Yeah.
Am I hearing selectively?
No, you're not.
No, I don't think so. And to me, and no, I don't think you're hearing selectively. And it's also to some extent a bit somewhat, maybe surprising is too strong, but like you would expect, again, like that kind of speech of us versus them, you tend to see that happen. Like if you believe things like, I don't know, like social identity theory and things like that, in moments of scarcity, right? When we're fighting over jobs, like there's not enough jobs for people, or like you'll see that us versus them discourse appear. Well, that's not the case right now. Like I said, things are going well. So it is to that, at least in that respect, a bit surprising to see him push those buttons so much. But no, yeah, I don't think you're hearing selectively. I think it is true that that's been central to the agenda, and it's been central to the agenda for the last 4 years as well. Like we keep talking about the same two bills, about Bill 21 and Bill 96. They were central to what he wanted to do, and he pushed them forward. He put all the effort into pushing them forward, and he's gonna keep hammering that nail for sure.
I'm wondering too, I was thinking about the implications, again, particularly for those outside Quebec, of the lifting of that frame of politics around sovereignty or federalism. As you said, the axis has shifted a little bit. And I wonder if for other Canadians, paradoxically, the constitutional debate allowed us almost to ignore nationalism. Right? In the following sense, like you had two types of Quebecers. You had sovereigntists and you had federalists. And yes, okay, we could all understand that there was a certain nationalism behind that, common to them all. But other Canadians didn't have to engage with nationalism as long as they had federalist allies. See what I mean? Because they could just pick their allies, and they had a common project of quote unquote keeping the country together. And that was, the meeting place. Mm-hmm. If you take that away now, again, other Canadians have to actually confront what it means to have a nation within a federation in a way that we actually could ignore when we were fighting the sovereigntists, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like I don't know if I would use, for example, the word federalist to describe myself. But it's not because I'm not Canadian. It's just that I feel like it used to be that conversations on nationalism in this country were monopolized by Quebec. Now it's coming from all over the place. And we're just having debates about Canada 150 and Canada Day. Should we celebrate Canada Day, not Canada Day? What does Canada mean? Is Canada built on genocide? It's coming from, it's also that generational shift that's happening in Quebec is also happening elsewhere, right? So the whole question of nationalism, I think, is now asked by people outside of Quebec, by people who are also wrestling with their own nationalism. And I think that changes the equation. And that is also felt in Quebec. So sometimes you have people, like the CAQ version of nationalism is very much, the number of times, I was just saying that as a joke, but the number of times that the word woke has been printed in Quebec media in the last 2 years, it seems like that's the biggest threat to the Quebec nation right now. It's big. I mean, it's happening all over North America, but there's a specific obsession with it in French Canadian media right now I guess since the death of George Floyd, because it was acceptable for a little while to not do that. And then there was the backlash that came happening. And now it's all about those people that, are going too far. And that is something that, when Quebec nationalism stands for that, now you also have conservatives in Toronto who are like, we like French Canadians, like standing up for themselves. And so you have those different alliances that are also happening, I feel, around the country, around people who don't like what Canada's been standing for. And I think I'm hearing a lot of criticism of that on the left in Canada. It's a generational divide in Canada. And then you have the same thing happening in Quebec. So I think I would maybe not position the conversation on nationalism and the way it's been transforming as something that's that exotic to the conversations I'm hearing and I'm participating into as well in Toronto. I feel like Quebec nationalism, there's an older generation that is now in power in the province that pushes it forward in a very old school way, and that is in reaction to social change that's been very much criticizing that narrative. And the same thing is happening in the different provinces as well, and at the federal level as well. It happens that you have now a federal government in power, but if you had a conservative government in power, you would have also a pushback against the change that have been happening in the way we're talking about Canadian nationalism, and you would have that same division that's also happening inside the country. So yes, so I think it's an issue in Quebec, it's an issue in Canada, but I think it's an issue in the US, it's an issue in France, it's an issue definitely in Italy, in Sweden, it's in Brazil. This kind of divisions on what it means to belong, I feel are happening all over the Western world right now, and Quebec is just one maybe fields in which those conversations are taking place. I don't know if that's the answer you were hoping for, but I think it's important to not just think of nationalism as something that Quebec does. I think that's very much sometimes the elephant in the room is like, what about you guys as nationalism? Because it's also all over the place and also a subject to a lot of debate. And it's been built with and or against Quebec's nationalism. And you cannot isolate Quebec if you from the conversations that are happening around nationalism around Canada as well.
I think everything Emily said is right, and I agree with her. But to go back to what you were asking, Andrew, about like relationship from outside Quebec, and like we were used to someone from outside Quebec was used to dealing with, like, if it was federalists, we knew what we could talk to them. It was sovereigntists, at least we knew what to expect to some extent, right? And I think that's important to remember, because there's also a limit to the autonomous posture that the CAQ is putting forward, right? If you're asking for more, to be more autonomous, for instance, on immigration, if the answer from the federal government is no, then what do you do? Like, if you were a federalist, well, we're fine, it's fine, we're staying in the federation anyways. And if we were sovereignist, well, we know what we would do. We'll call a referendum. If we keep hearing no and no and no, we'll call a referendum. But if you're an autonomist and the federal government keeps saying you no, then what do you do? Like, it's a posture that at some point has its limit, and we'll see what happens and where it leads. But it is a difficult one to stay in at some point.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up some of our data here. Too much, but partly just to talk about what's driving this, because I think we can acknowledge that Legault has been successful at mobilizing maybe insecurities, as you were talking about, Emily. But I think it would go too far to say that he's manufactured them, right? And so that's why I think sometimes it's worth kind of just spending 2 seconds with some of the data that Charles and I have collected and been working on. So you can see that there's a question about perception of the threat to the French language among francophones in Quebec that's been asked now for 30 years or so. And it's more or less that it's that sort of concern about the security of the French language is more or less at the highest level, dipped a little bit in the last survey, but more or less is higher now than it was at the sort of peak of the sovereignty movement in the 1980s and the 1990s. And you have more or less the same trend on another question, which is even a little bit more provocative, about whether Quebec francophones think that they're looked down upon or seen as inferior by English Canadians. So this is, decades after the Quiet Revolution, decades after the transfer of economic power, you could say, from Anglophone Montreal to Francophone. Nonetheless, you have growing concern about the security of the French language and a growing unease at how French Canadians, it's not the modern term, Francophones in Quebec feel they are perceived in the rest of the country. How can we square these developments with you know, the fact that, you know, the economy is going well in Quebec and it's going well in francophone hands in Quebec. Is like it. I mean, maybe the question, and I'm going to ask Charles because he was kind of part of the research team of this first. Like, should we stop being surprised by this?
I mean, if you ask me, I was especially surprised on that question, where we looked at the effect of having a university degree on agreement with this statement, and we were comparing 2001 to 2022, so the 20-year gap. And in 2001, if you had a university degree, you were much less likely to agree with that statement than if you didn't have one. In 2022, that difference disappeared. Like having a university degree, you were not more or less likely than someone without a university degree to agree with that statement in 2022, which really surprised me completely. So I don't know if we should stop being surprised. Again, like those are questions. That's a question that I'd never really had seen before. So I was happy when you suggested it, and if you had asked me to guess, I don't think I would have guessed that it would have been higher in 2022 than it was before during the two referendums, which is what the data is here, right? You have before the first and during the second and after the second referendum. I would not have guessed that. So I was surprised. But it also explains, knowing what we know about opinions in Quebec and just the results of the election, it explains a lot though. Like those when the data that we see on the feeling of French language being threatened, the feeling that we see as being the feeling of being looked upon or feeling inferior to English Canadians. It does explain a lot. So maybe in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised because the manifestation in both in electoral politics and in just general discourse in the province kind of hints at those feelings.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to react more to the first part about language and linguistic insecurities. I will say that you're right to point that the premier did not manufacture those insecurities. However, I will say that the media do play a role in manufacturing insecurities. And we had actually a report on that, not on language, but when the unfamous reasonable accommodation crisis happened in the 2000s, it was just a bunch of anecdotes, including sometimes religious minorities that were over-reported and misreported by media, who ended up creating a perception of crisis, unreasonable accommodation. And the report said basically we have a crisis of perception more than we have an actual crisis. And I would say that there is the same phenomenon that's been intensifying in the French language as well, where every day you have, I mean, people working with Québécois going on Twitter saying things like, the other day I went at a restaurant in the Plateau and they gave me an English menu. Oh my God, I feel so horrible. So you do have that stuff every day that does feed into people's anxiety. However, there has been ways in which language use have been transforming in the last 20 years that are very real. One example I could give is, for example, my generation, captive in the 90s by whatever cable was offering us, was watching a lot of French Canadian television. Now, Gen Z going on Netflix, there is not necessarily that reach of French Canadian culture for the next generation. So people are polling things like, yes, Bill 101 kids, as we call them, you know, children of allophones have gone to French schools. They speak French, but maybe they're not engaging with francophone Quebec culture as much as others are. But the thing is, nobody under the age of 25 really does anymore, because of the ways in which basically global capitalism is affecting every regional cultures around the world, and including the so-called CanCon and the way that, you know, it's really hard as well for Canadians to actually watch Canadian content. It's just that there's that additional layer of anxiety that it creates for Quebecers. Another source of explanation would be transformation as well in just the economies and what kind of companies come to Montreal, and it's that very speaking from the two sides of the mouth kind of thing, where people are very proud when they attract, large American companies to have their office based in Montreal, but then you realize all the higher ranks of those companies tend to work in English, and that means that if you want to climb up the ladder a little bit of your career, even in Montreal, there's a point in which if you're not bilingual, you're going to stall. And people are very proud when those companies come to Quebec, but then they realize it's having an impact on how much French is speaking at work. And but no premier will, say we will have less American companies come in Montreal and close our economies in order to protect the French language, right? So the result is it's much easier to say we won't have people coming up the Roxham Road, or we won't have many more immigrants coming in, or we won't. And so basically there's a lack of tools that modern states have to address global capitalism. Therefore, they're looking at the small guys that they can point as the fault for the ways in which economies has been transforming in ways that impact linguistic practices in a way that makes them anxious. And that's not just a Quebec thing. Once again, it's also something that's happening all over Europe as well. We're having 21st century problems, and nation state is a 19th century structure, and there's limits to what it can do to deal with 21st century problems. And so the scapegoating phenomenon is only going to increase, and it's increasing in Europe, and it does have an impact in American politics for sure, in Quebec politics, and there is nothing that tells me that there can be an effect as well in Canadian politics overall.
Let me offer.
Once again, maybe I also didn't answer like you wanted to.
I have no preconceived notions of how you should.
Yeah.
But indulge me, and I will give I'm going to give my own answer, which is it goes in a different direction, because I think that to me that question starts to make sense if you bring in the wider Canadian discourse around language. So if we go back to the census publication on official languages, comes out every 5 years. It just came out this summer. And we're used to how when that data lands, it triggers a series of op-eds in Quebec where the demographers argue, right? They argue about what's the important question: first language, home language, language of work, how many languages you can
First
speak.
official language spoken. That's the new one.
Yeah. So everyone counts and tries to decide whether if it went from 81 to 80%, how big it, et cetera. This year, it triggered a whole other stream of op-eds outside of Quebec about how bilingualism is dead. The dream of bilingualism is dead. There are people who have been waiting since 1969 to write an op-ed about how Pierre Trudeau was wrong and a dreamer and an optimist and so on. And they finally get their chance because only X% of Canadians outside Quebec can speak French properly, and so on and so forth. And then so that's one brand of rhetoric, which is, can we finally get past this, idea that we're supposed to be a bilingual country? And then that comes out very specifically around issues of the appointment of federal officials, the Governor General, the Governor of the Bank of Canada. Do you have are you disqualified from running for party leadership because you can't speak French and so on? So the discourse around language outside Quebec has not created an environment where you would expect the answers to this question to be very different. Right? So in that sense, I cease to be surprised, because I'm not sure if the rest of the country is sending signals around the security of the French language, right? And so it's easy to just focus on the Quebec actors around this, whether the premier or the demographers or the editorialists and so on. But is there not a sort of wider responsibility in the country around creating atmospheres of security for different communities?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And even not just if we're considering bilingualism, but also just French Canadian minorities outside Quebec, right? Where when you see those numbers coming in every 5 years, it's always worse than worse. Like it never really improves. And so again, like playing the French is threatened card in Quebec always works, because in the end, whatever the data you're using, it is kind of true, right? It's not always going down, but it is to some extent under threat because of just the geographical location of the province. So, I mean, you don't need to have that much data to show how many percentage points it's lost in the last 5 years. Like in the end, the state of affairs is that it is threatened just by the fact that it's in North America. As you said, the message that it's receiving also from outside Quebec and Canada is not that it's really going better there. So, I mean, that's part of the reason why it works. It's and why you see the stability, especially in the recent years around this, is just because for most people, like and to be honest, it's interesting because I think the answer to that question would probably be lower if you asked people in Montreal, where there is actually other languages than French, whereas it's probably in places where there is actually not a lot of people speaking other language than French that people feel like the French language is threatened. And there, I think you put the point on the finger on media as being one reason why that's the case. And to be honest, Montreal is becoming an interesting ecosystem for the French language, where, I mean, languages are not static, right? They're dynamic, and the French language is, and it's a bit of an aside, but the French language in Montreal is also kind of changing. There's a great report in Le Devoir about how kids nowadays, like, they will integrate Arab words in their sentences just because of there's a lot of immigration coming from the Maghreb in Montreal, and English words and French words, and they all speak that language together on the recess, during recess. And there's also that happening within Montreal that, like, it's not an experience that someone in Chicoutimi has necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Which again, different postures, and those people wouldn't say that French language is threatened, I would guess. So the people in Montreal. So.
No, yeah, you have the same, a lot of Creole in Montreal French, the way you have a lot of patois in Toronto English, and that's been a thing. But I wanted to say, to your point about the dynamic with the rest of the country, I think you're right that it plays into it somewhat, at least for the people who are aware of what's going on in the rest of the country, which is mostly like governing elites. But I will say, just to give a concrete example, the Federation of Francophone Communities and Acadians, FCFA, has been fighting for 20 years for the federal government to have a higher proportion of people who speak French to be part of immigration all over Canada, outside of Quebec. Essentially, the reasoning was there were 4.4% of Francophones in Canada outside of Quebec back in 2001, I think, and they want to increase the number of immigrants so that this number, we go back to that number actually, because no Canadian government has actually done anything to actually match that dimension. So that number has been going on. So when we talk about François Legault asking for more powers on immigration and not trusting Ottawa to actually select immigrants that would, help the French language to thrive, it is happening in a context where everything in Ottawa shows you that he's kind of right, that when you let Ottawa decide things on immigration, the proportion of French speakers in Canada just decline, and there's no reason for that. There are Francophones all over the world. It's one of the biggest international languages in the world. The one reason I see for that is that the most Francophones in the world live in Africa, and we do have a country that has a history of discrimination against Black people. And so that's why there's a smaller proportion of Francophones who are coming to Canada. But that's the reality of how much, when there's a distrust coming from, French language is under threat, or we cannot trust Ottawa with files like immigration, it's coming as well from, there's no smoke without fire, I guess is what I'm trying to say. However, the fact that you have a CAQ nationalism that's mostly about Quebec first and Quebec only means that they're not going to be trying to build solidarity bridges with Francophone communities outside of Quebec who are trying to make that file, push that file forward, right? So Francophone communities are not getting help from Quebec, the Quebec government, in trying to put that forward. So there's also a two solitudes going on between Francophone communities in this country, those who live in Quebec and the other ones, and that division has been perhaps made worse, I would say, by the kind of debates we've been having in Quebec in the last years. There's less solidarity with other Francophones now, I feel, than they were under different governments.
So let's try and tie some of these themes up about the direction of Quebec nationalism, about how much the reaction of the rest of the country can backfire in terms of fueling some of the insecurities and about issues around discrimination. So that brings us to Bill 21, Bill 96 to a certain extent. And one of the reasons I think I'm kind of interested in this discussion about, you know, where Quebec nationalism goes next is because we're anticipating that these conversations around these two pieces of legislation are not finished. They're sort of ongoing within Quebec itself. But if the Canadian Supreme Court weighs in ultimately, either way makes a decision, it will kind of, you know, bring it to the top of the agenda. I guess one question I have is how the rest of the country can engage with that debate, which is a debate about belonging and values and so on, but without living up to their own stereotype, or the stereotype of how they might be perceived in Quebec, of Quebec bashing, looking down, as we've seen, looking down on French Canadians as inferior and so on. How can we sustain this kind of constructive dialogue around some of these issues without making it worse? And to kind of start talking about that, Emily, I thought I'd bring you back to the federal election, the last federal election, the leaders debate, where the question came up and the reaction to the question came up. And you wrote a piece after that, which I found very helpful. And if I'm not mistaken, part of what you were arguing in that piece, which you wrote in English for the audience out of Quebec, which was, you're not helping necessarily, right? That it's one thing to condemn Bill 21, but the way in which, you know, that came out was not actually moving us forward. So I'm wondering if you can kind of pick up on that moment of why you wrote that, and then kind of get us to this question of, is there any way for people in Ontario, for instance, to engage in debates around that doesn't just inflame the situation further?
I feel like it's going to be easier to answer this question now at this point of the conversation, because there's been some puzzle pieces put in place already. But what I said earlier about François Legault is tapping into French Canadian insecurity, and how, like, his main point seemed to be, we're as good as you guys are. And he seems to be so insecure about that, and he seems to be repeating it over and over and over. If you're coming from a criticism, the criticism to Bill 21 or Bill 96, with the angle of why Quebecers are so racist, you're just essentially helping him with that game of tapping into French Canadian insecurities and why are we inferior? We're not inferior. We should be treated as equal. So it becomes fuel for his fire. Regardless of the actual impact of Bill 21 and Bill 96, who both, fuel systemic racism. That's not my point. I'm just saying that when you come at it from that angle, what you're doing is helping him. And so that's one thing. In terms of solutions, I'd say when people are only concerned about Islamophobia that is taking place in the province and over which they have no control, I find that hypocritical. Therefore, if you mind your own business first and then look at what's going on elsewhere, it's a different story. There was just an attack last year in London. So there's plenty of Islamophobia to look at in Ontario as well. So depending on where it's coming from, the criticism is coming from. There's obviously, when it's coming from Muslim communities themselves, there's no doubt on that. But I think there's people who are, looking at Quebec as being the site where racism in Canada happens, because God knows that the rest of Canada doesn't have that pesky racism, right? And so when I feel like the criticism is coming from that place, I feel like there needs to be just do your own work first, and then we're going to talk. And then the other thing that I would say is, be mindful of that adding fuel to the fire. And the third thing I would say is that there's been a lot of criticism of Bill 21 and Bill 96 that have been coming from Quebec itself. And the thing is, oftentimes there's groups that feel like they need to come in and save Quebec. Yeah, and then Quebec, and you're actually a lot of the time it comes from groups that are either Toronto based or Ottawa based who have just more money, so they have the means to, for example, put up some legal action just quicker, and they just like jump on the file, and there's not necessarily a lot of coordination with groups that have been doing this work locally, and the kind of language that they can use can actually just make it worse for people on the ground, and they're not going to be on the ground to suffer those effects because they're not based in Quebec, right? So if they have a missteps in terms of how they communicate, they're not the ones facing the consequences. So that what's make it tricky. However, I do feel like at this point, because there's been, for example, a court challenge against Bill 21 has been initiated by Quebecers themselves. For example, now if the federal government wants to intervene in that, now it makes sense. But for the federal government to initiate the protest against Bill 21, I think would have been very ill advised, because you would kind of prove Legault's point that everybody in Quebec is in agreement for that, and it's just Ottawa trying to impose its view of what Quebecers need to be that is creating their position. It's really, really important if we're gonna win this fight for the movement to be built from within Quebec. And it basically, because Legault and others have been building their arguments that it's about Quebec values, there's only Quebecers who are positioned in a way to make the point, that are positioned to make the point that actually, no, we are Quebecers and these are not our values. So that's why it's so tricky. You can have different objectives. If you want to scrap the bill, there's ways in which you can use the court to scrap the bills, maybe, but not with the notwithstanding clause, but that's another conversation. But if you want to solve the social debate, which is what has really been harming, I guess, people on the ground the most, there's a certain way you need to go about doing things. And I feel like I'm obviously very aware of the consequences of the bill legally for example, women who want to work as teachers in Quebec, but the impact of the bill is so much wider than that, and it's the social climate it's creating. And if you want to heal the social climate, it's not just about saying that, okay, the bill is gone. If the bill is gone the wrong way, if you pick the wrong way of making the bill gone, maybe the bill is going to be gone, but the social climate might be worse. And that's what I'm afraid of personally. And that's what makes me so careful in terms of what words I'm choosing, the way we go about organizing. It's about healing the society, not just getting rid of a piece of legislation. And I think if you have that goal as well, then you start understanding why some people are so careful in terms of what words you use and how you do it. It's not about not being able to identify systemic racism the way it plays in a certain piece of legislation. It's just about trying to heal a division in society, which is a lot more complex than scrapping a bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what I can add to that. I think one thing that I would say though is one thing to be mindful of, and I think Emily touched on it, is to keep in mind that the pluralism within Quebec society, right? There are voices from within also that are fighting that battle. And in that case, I think Legault is also to blame because he keeps portraying it as there's a consensus in Quebec around Bill 21 and Bill 96, which I don't know what a consensus is in terms of percentages, but on Bill 21, like maybe there's like 52, 53, 55%, but when is the consensus? When does the consensus high enough that we can't even talk about it? We're not there. We're definitely not there. So when Legault is saying there's a consensus on Bill 21 in Quebec, that's just not true. The debate is still happening. So being mindful of that there is pluralism. And I know it can be hard when the premier keeps saying that everyone agrees and that's the way we live in Quebec. That's just not true. Like on the ground, there are people who disagree. And I also think that there will be, and Emily pointed to it, I think that the federal government, we keep asking the federal government to intervene. I think they were actually wise to wait. And there will be a role there to play for Quebec MPs that are from the Liberal government, and David Limiti, the Justice Minister, is one of those, to present that view also from within Quebec. That is against Bill 21. So that time will come. There are things that are not necessarily useful. For instance, people like Patrick Brown or John Tory, the city of Toronto, saying we will join in and against Bill 21 at the Supreme Court. That doesn't really help anyone. Like, it helps you maybe with your base, maybe it's popular on the ground where you are, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really change anything. It will follow its course in the Supreme Court, and again, the federal government will play some of that role when it's time to do it.
Can I just add one more thing? I feel like the reflex coming from, the Patrick Brown base or whatever is very much like, this is not what Canada is about. And like, we're Canadian and that's not what, like, and so basically you're using Bill 21 to make a point about what you want Canada to be. And that's fine, but that's just very exotic to me. I'll just leave it at that. Like, it's not the way, that's just not there's lots of ways to have ethical debates about human rights, but I guess that's come back to my earlier point. Like, you can't have conversations about Quebec nationalism if you are not aware of how much your own relationship with Canadian nationalism is very complex and complicated. And you're always trying to make point about that while using the other, actually talking about the other nationalism over there. So like, fix your own relationship with nationalism. And then, that's going to be also more helpful.
Let's share a couple of observations, and then I kind of want to, I have a question about laïcité, I guess. So, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, I don't think you were necessarily joking, but that sort of assumption that, the starting point that's not helpful is just to say, why are Quebecers more racist than anyone else? But at the Environics Institute, we spend a lot of time presenting data about how all Canadians feel about diversity, about multiculturalism, citizenship, immigration. And I think it's fair to say there is almost never a presentation that I give outside Quebec where someone doesn't ask the question, yeah, but none of that applies to Quebec, right? So there is this assumption somehow that Quebecers are starting in a very different place, just about, not before we get to Bill 21, but just about, issues around ethnicity and race and so on. And so I threw up another slide, and this one is, it's new data, but I could have picked any year from the last 10 years. There's just 3 different questions about immigration and showing the answers between Quebec francophones and the rest of Canadians. And on these particular questions, there's no difference, right? There's absolutely no difference whether they're positively phrased or negatively phrased questions. And when I said just that it's not new, if it's going to be, oh, there's me. Sorry. Okay, we'll leave it there. It's not new. So, we can show the trend over years, and it's really never been the case, right? That that the two societies, I think, are starting from a fundamentally different point. So it kind of begs the question of why people outside of Quebec have this assumption, have this stereotype. And some of that is, as Charles says, maybe the premier doesn't help sometimes. But as I don't want to put words in your mouth, Emily, but I think part of it is maybe it's easier for other Canadians not to ask too many questions about themselves. But the point I'm building to, having made that observation, is there's Quebec and Ontario over the years just on that one question of whether there's too much immigration, right? So it's just both society has changed. They've changed more or less in lockstep. But the work that we've done in our surveys, but others like our friend Luc Turgeon and others have done around laïcité, have kind of sustained the argument that there is, put it this way, it's not a ruse, right? It's not to to start from the discussion that Quebecers have a different relationship with religion and the position of religion in society and the relationship between the religion and the state is not inventing things. And not only that, but to argue that some who are prioritizing laïcité are coming at that from a rights-based point of view, right? I guess the way of simplifying it, in our data, you can show that if outside of Quebec, if you're for and against Bill 21, it basically just corresponds with whether you're for and against immigrants. I mean, it just lines up, right? So if you're, I mean, to be overly simplistic, outside of Quebec, if you're xenophobic, you like Bill 21, and if you're not, you don't. And that relationship just doesn't hold in Quebec, right? Because the values around laïcité complicate it and lead to the fact that many people who are upholding values of equality nonetheless end up in a space that would be different from someone in Ontario. So all of that is to kind of lead to the question of how do we engage with this without maybe this is too provocative, but without letting people off the hook, right? In the sense of how do we both acknowledge the place that the commitment to laïcité plays in a society like Quebec, without then ending up in the space where either, well, we can't question anything, or we can't, or you can't call out something like Bill 21 just because it has this other sort of frame around it. Sorry if that was a long question, but I think the point is that of all the things that might confuse people outside Quebec, I think laïcité is at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Because it's not front and center here. If anything, societies outside of Quebec are becoming more religious in some ways over time, and not more secular, just with the influence of the way immigration is playing out differently and so on. And so it's not on the political agenda outside of Quebec, and it is the most difficult part to engage in, especially when politicians like Blanchette just use it as a shield, right? We have laïcité, it's our values, you can't question us, go home, right? So I'm trying to find the middle ground between we don't understand this and we can't question it and so on. And where is the pathway into a constructive conversation around what that means and what it means for discussions around that piece of legislation?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's the right way to put it. Again, I think having been in BC during all those debates around, I lived in BC during all those debates around Bill 21, but before that too, the Charter of Quebec Values that the PQ government had presented, and you put it the right way when, like, for many outside of Quebec, only xenophobes will support those bills. But when you talk to Quebecers, you often get the sense that there is no xenophobe who support those bills in Quebec either, when in fact,
there's a lot of them too.
The truth is somewhere in between, right? It's not only xenophobic people who support Bill 21 in Quebec, but there is a group of people who support Bill 21 for those reasons too, right? But the place of religion is an interesting one. I think there is a big part of Quebec society who doesn't even see any value in religion. Like, it's just completely excluded from even how people live their life, right? And so they start from this basis. So it's difficult to explain to them why the impact that a bill like Bill 21 can have. But there's also, like, I think the individual rights aspect of it at some point, I think, is still the where you need to start the discussion, and that's what probably will happen when it gets to the Supreme Court, because those are arguments, I think, that could make sense for many of those people in the long run.
Yeah, I'm going to cite a different studies, but there was just this summer, the Association of Canadian Studies did a poll with Léger Marketing. And essentially, well, there's different aspects to the study, but the one aspect that they did with leisure marketing is basically divide people who support and oppose Bill 21 based on, hard supporters, hard opposers, and then the mushy middle, and just focus on the hard supporters and the strongly opposed. And when you looked at strong supporters of Bill 21, you could say who has a negative perception of, it's interesting how the way they divided it. First, Islam, second, Muslims, and second, the hijab, right? And they did that with Sikh, the turban, and Sikhism, the religion, and the Kippah, Judaism, and then Jewish folks. And it's basically a scale where if you are a strong supporter of Bill 21, you really do not like the hijab, you really do not like Islam, you really do not like Muslim people, but a little bit less. So it's like this, the religious symbol is the worst, then the religion comes second, and then people are slightly less dislike, but we're talking about 80% level of dislikes for people who support Bill 21. And then a little bit less in the 70s for Sikh symbol, Sikh religion, and Sikh people. And I think it was in the low 30% for basically anti-Semitism testers. And you had also criticism of the Catholicism religion, but much lower. So basically you had a sliding scale of which religion was the best. And when you looked at people who oppose Bill 21, you basically have people who are equally prejudiced against all religions, but very little for all religions. So basically people will dislike all religions. Only 20% of people who roughly, I don't have the numbers right here, but only 20% of people who oppose Bill 21 dislike religions, but they dislike all of them equally, essentially. And I think that was really telling, that you had this, basically the religious symbol is worse, then the religion comes second, and the people comes third. But then it's really about Islamophobia, and then Sikhism, because I think a lot of people are just too ignorant to tell the difference. And then really, right? And then anti-Semitism there, but not as strong. And then people being criticized, being critical of their own Catholic heritage and their own Christian heritage. And I think that's real, and it does tie obviously with immigration somewhat, but it's not thought of as necessarily against immigration, right? It's just thought of, it's the mental category that's mobilized is different, but it still translates into some prejudice. Now, that being said, there is, of course, a lot of people who support Bill 21 who are part of intellectual tradition that goes back to France, which is like all religions are darkness, and we are pro-science and we are pro-secularism. And there is that tradition that's part of the left. And it's been part of the left in France, but that's been part of the left in France for 200 years before it ended up having to do anything to do with banning the hijabs or religious symbols specifically, right? The secularism in France, that intellectual tradition goes back to the French Revolution. And the first secularism bill that is Quebec, like we had in France, dates back to the beginning of the 2000s, post 9/11. So those are, I think, facts that are helpful to have, that there is a strong opposition to religious minorities that have been crafted, as I was saying, going back to the reasonable accommodation crisis. However, there are ways in which, when it comes to, if you ask people about race, then maybe you're going to have even more colorblind kind of responses that you have in the rest of the country. So the different, I guess, categories that people use to talk about their dislike of the others, I think varies. But I think it's just important to understand what and how. And I will say that there's also, people in Montreal my age have had very little, usually, or no contact with religion if they didn't want to. I grew up in the countryside where, Maxime Bernier is from, like that region of Quebec. It was, for my own generation, is like I had a priest coming in my public elementary school, and I had nuns teaching me in high school. And so there's very much a cultural Catholicism that is, I think, like people in the city tend to underestimate. And that plays into what we love to call Catholaicité or Catholic secularism, which is that, like, yes, we're a secular state, but it took so many years to take the cross away from the presidencies at the National Assembly. And it's just like, don't touch our heritage, where we like to just like have those beautiful churches they are part of our architectural heritage, and we're proud of that. So there's that kind of double speak that's happening as well. And that really plays well if you're tapping into rural votes. And François Legault is very good at doing that as well, in terms of being like, no, that's not about secularism. That's just about Quebec history and heritage, right? So Catholicism is about history and heritage. The other people are actually about religion. And that's how you ended up having a discourse that's technically about equal rights, but has different impacts on different people. But yes, it's a little bit, once again, a tangent away from the question of immigration, but I think it's important to say, it's just that people will not say I'm against immigration, but people will say I'm against the hijab, and it happens that most people who wear the hijab are second or first generation Quebecers. So, yeah.
I want to ask just you to expand on one point, but we went on a little longer, so I am going to see if there's a couple questions in just a second. So just be right with you. But just to clarify that, because I started out by saying, well, secularism, laïcité is not a ruse, right? It's a real thing. But correct me if I'm wrong. I thought I heard you saying almost the opposite, that there's lots of people there's secular tradition, there's lots of ways of being secularism. It's a distraction because we need to confront Islamophobia and other forms of prejudice. Am I understanding you right? That you're essentially saying don't let someone like Blanchette play the laïcité card, because it's a way of just deflecting attention away from the debate that needs to be happening about different forms of exclusion.
I'm saying that the secularism debates in former Catholic-dominated countries, so that will include Quebec, France, Spain, Portugal, those debates are very real. And how to basically, because the Catholic Church has a state-like structure, making that structure not map itself onto the actual state and distinguish the two is a very complicated exercise. I mean, look at politics in Latin America. It's definitely not over as a process. However, what I'm saying is that making that century-long debate about secularism in Catholic culture countries about the hijab, that is like a 20-year-old thing that is very much linked to post 9/11 politics. There is, however, a lot of people who latch onto that, who were into secularism long before it became about that. There is also a lot of people who came at this debate, for example, in the Quebec feminist movement, which I was a part of, who were initially against religious symbols for all women because they associated religion with their own oppression, historically, their own ancestors, their own French Canadian ancestors, and they were all against it. But when they understood that this was kind of an ethnocentric way of reasoning it, they started to move their own position. So yes, there are people who, when they were first exposed to that question, were for banning religious symbols because they were like, yes, I'm for secularism, therefore I'm for banning religious symbols. And then when the debate started to happen, they were like, oh, okay, I actually understand that this might be against the human rights of religious minorities. But the way the debate happened, it's not a coincidence that we started having an obsession over that after 9/11. It is, however, a very old question as well. I don't know if that makes sense, but basically I'm saying both are true. Like, it's a very old question, and there's ways in which the way it's been, Muslim people specifically have been at the center of this debate. That's very much not a 200 years old thing. I guess maybe you could say it's millennia old, and it goes back to the Ottoman Empire. But I mean, there's ways in which it has become back. It's basically also a thing that has been sparked by post 9/11 North American and just global politics as well. So I think both are true.
All right, thank you. Let's take a couple questions. Okay, you had one. Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for taking time to come out and talk to us today. So to keep it brief, I'm wondering if you guys have opinions about why the Conservative Party party's leader in Quebec wasn't able to pivot the conversation towards COVID and Legault's lockdowns and things like that, instead of away from nationalism. And then also, if you can identify any other watershed moments for anti-immigration sentiment or nationalism other than the reasonable accommodations thing, just because even on the graphs, it seems like mid-2000s, it spikes as to like when people are feeling like they're inferior, et cetera. So I was wondering if there was anything past that.
On the second one, I'm not sure. On the first one, I think he did talk a lot about that. The Conservative Party did, and the leader did talk a lot about lockdowns and what Legault did. I think it's also, in a way, smart on his part to not be just about that, because in 4 years, that won't be the issue anymore. So in a way, it was smart of him to not make it just about that. We'll see how successful he is. It'll be hard for 4 years without a seat in the National Assembly to keep that, 13% of people who will just tune out. Like I think it was showed that there's a lot of those votes coming from people who never vote actually. So in 4 years, those people might actually go back to their old ways and just not vote, given there is hopefully no pandemic then. But on your second question, I'm not sure.
Not sure how easy it is to answer the second question. Just ask Emily, are we going to be talking about the Conservative Party in 4 years in Quebec, the provincial Conservative Party?
Maybe. It's hard because Éric Duhem doesn't have a seat in the National Assembly, so it's kind of like Maxime Bernier only lives on Twitter now, right? So,
but he's much smarter than Maxime Bernier, so that's one reason why he can. No, but he's good at playing the game in a way that doesn't make him sound like a total quack, right? So
he spent his career.
Sense, the staying power is much more there than it is for Maxime Bernier.
Yeah, he spent his career as a political advisor for a lot of governments, including I think the Harper government. But on your second question, yeah, I think nobody can know, but I can say that there's, on top of the reasonable accommodation debate, there's been, we just mentioned the Charter of Quebec value debate, which led to a bill that never passed essentially, but still created a lot of stir. There's been the debate on systemic racism. There's been the whole issue of Roxham Road and whether or not we want the people who've been coming up as asylum seekers to stay or not. So there's been just a decade of really heavy divisive identity politics happening in the province. Yeah, I think both social movements that have pushed for more inclusion have gone stronger, and then people have also just maybe strengthened their ranks against that if they oppose that. And so I think there's just more polarizing that's been happening. And once again, that's not just a Quebec thing.
Okay, we've got four. So let's take two at a time. So there's the gentleman here, and then the one right in front. Yeah, go ahead.
Interesting for me is how this conversation has migrated from Quebec nationalism into what I consider the subliminal activism in terms of how fragility our citizenship is in terms of civility. And this was going throughout the conversation, direct or indirect. And then when the concept of laissez-faire, whether one should or should not, illustrates for me is, as many have said prior, what is Canada that we have no reason to exist except for the fact that for whatever reason there is an ineluctability of civility. And how long will this civility be able to continue in terms of providing what I call the nectar, binding 10 provinces, several territories together in an element of congruence, notwithstanding that our politicians enjoy what I call ejaculative rhetoric without any form of substance. And I'm signifying the current one. And then we have someone who would like to be, who's talking about, say, frames, and is not recognizing that you can't have it both ways. And Quebec has always been, in my judgment, going over years, what I call the microbe that is stimulating a conversation because it is inferior in terms of language and that it needs to survive. And Margaret Atwood, I thought, put it quite eloquently in Lesser Défense in terms of the existence of Canada and Quebec. And so I'm just curious as to what are you thinking? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Or are you value neutral? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take the question from the gentleman in front too, and we'll work them at a time, and then we'll have two questions over here.
I have two questions. The first deals with immigration. I'm not clear. That's entirely what it is Quebec wants that they don't have now. My understanding is that Quebec has more control over immigration than any other province. that Quebec has immigration officers abroad in a way that the other provinces don't, that Quebec can, and it does, restrict the number of immigrants it brings in, that Quebec can insist that the immigrants coming speak French. So what is it, when we hear about the immigration file in Quebec, what is it that they want that they don't have? That's my first question. The second question deals with the word that I haven't heard. Yet, if I listen to CBC radio and CBC TV, it occupies every day. It's the question of Indigenous peoples. This word hasn't come up in the discussion, and I know that the Quebec National Assembly, maybe in the 90s, recognized 11 Aboriginal nations in Quebec, which leads me to this other question. When we talk about the Quebec nation, how many nations are there in Quebec? In English Canada, we seem to use this term First Nations. Doesn't seem to be part of the debate at all now in Quebec. And I get the sense that if you listen to Radio Canada, which I don't, I'm a unilingual Anglophone from Western Canada with some resentment about bilingualism, but I live with the Quebecers. I get the feeling that indigeneity is just not part of the media language.
Okay, let's do it this way, because the first question we had, if you permit me, I'm actually going to say, let's wrap up on that one. So we are going to answer your question. We're going to do that as our wrap up. Let's take these questions now. We're a little over time. We have a reception, but we'll get to two. So on the question of immigration and then indigeneity is going to be difficult in a short.
Just on immigration, and I mean, Phil can correct me if I'm wrong, but what Quebec wants is power over family reunification. That the federal government is currently controlling, making sure again that they can prioritize French speakers. It's just that, because everything you said was right. Like, they already have a lot of powers over immigration, but the one thing that they want this time is more power over family reunification.
Which goes to my point about scapegoating, because I mean, your grandma coming over from wherever is not the threat to the French language. But that being said, to the question of Indigenous peoples, I guess that's what I was talking about when I said, Canadian nationalism is being challenged now, and it's not just coming from Quebec anymore. It's very much that conversation about, Canada 150 and Canada Day. It's about genocide, and it's about Indigenous people. And I feel like the conversation on what Canada stands for is evolving, because First Nations, Métis and Inuit becoming a very strong driver of that conversation in the rest of the country. And I feel like a lot of intellectuals in Quebec don't understand that this is the conversation that's happening now, like in the rest of Canada. It's really interesting the way, for example, a lot of more conservative intellectuals in Quebec believe that Canada is all about multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is this thing that was invented to kill Quebec. And then when I look at federal policy, multiculturalism is not something that the federal government talks about as much anymore, because it's talking a lot more about anti-racism and its anti-racism strategy, because multiculturalism was pushed by a generation of newcomers to Canada that was about diversity, less about solving structural inequalities. So that now they're moving on to a vocabulary that helps them address those structural inequalities more. And Quebec hasn't noticed that this is a criticism of multiculturalism that has been taking place in the rest of the country, right? And so they're having this debate amongst themselves about a Canada that no longer exists in some ways. So to go back specifically on the question of Indigenous people in Quebec, it has played a huge role in the conversation on systemic racism in Quebec. A lot of it has been pushed by First Nations, especially the Atikamekw Nation and Joyce Echequan. That when she passed away, essentially she filmed her own death in a Joliette hospital at the fall of 2020. That really sparked a conversation. A lot of First Nation leadership in Quebec in the last years has been about pushing François Legault to acknowledge that systemic racism exists. There's been other files, but that's been the one thing that has garnered the most attention in terms of that, and whether there is one nation or 11 nations in Quebec and what that means. I think that's a question that actually Québec Solidaire has been wrestling with a lot when it comes to how they understand their own project, what it means to be a country. And so they've been trying to build relationship with a lot of First Nations leaders in terms of being, okay, so if we want Quebec to be a country, but we don't we understand that we're on indigenous land. What does that actually mean, right? So that tension is not solved at all, but it's actually explored by a lot of people on the left in Quebec. And I would love to know that it's also explored in the rest of the country as much by people who say we are, for decolonization. I'm not saying that same conversation, okay, of existential conversation in terms of, okay, what does it mean to organize the country differently? But I think the advantage of trying to build a new country is that you ask at least a question of how would that look like? So it's a conversation that's taking place. It's taking place at a different pace. For example, the TRC report was very much an English report and only just translated afterwards, right? So, and the whole question of the responsibility of Francophones and what happened in residential schools, of course, there's a responsibility. Of course, if there's a responsibility of the Catholic Church, there's a responsibility of a lot of French Canadians. But it hasn't been something that's been in the public discourse for as long as it's been, I feel, in English. Only started to pop out maybe just last summer when with the conversation on Mark Grace, but I feel like there's been a lag in terms of just general public education around the TRC, because so much of the TRC has actually happened in English. So there's lots of debates on the place of First Nations in Quebec happening as well, but I feel like it has its own trigger, it's its own media cycle, it's its own conversation, it's its own drama, and it's its own issues, and it's its own style, and it plays itself at a different rhythm and with different poles and triggers.
If I may just compliment, I think one thing, I think you're absolutely right. The discussions around Indigenous people in Quebec right now are really about systemic racism. It's not, the questions and the debates and the discussions is really not in terms of like a nation to nation or UNDRIP. Like there's nothing about like the United Nations rights of Indigenous people, the way it has in BC or even at the federal level. Those discussions are not happening. Maybe they will in the future, but it's very much in terms of systemic racism that those questions are discussed and addressed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll promise to wrap up after this, but we have the gentleman right at the back and then Anna. And so we'll take those two questions together.
Hi there, I'm Sharupra. I'm with the UCP Government of Alberta. So I have a bit of a two-part question, but I'll keep it brief. I'm wondering what the relationship is going to look like between this new Legault government, part 2, and the Francophonie hors Québec and the rest of Canada. And particularly, is that file, Francophone relations outside of Quebec, being driven by the Premier's office or by Minister Lebel's office, and who's taking charge? And then part 2 of that question, maybe for Mr. Parkin on the data side, as I notice a lot of the data distinguishes between Quebec Francophones only and then the rest of Canada agnostic of language. Well, when you isolate the 1 million or so Francophones outside of Quebec in the rest of Canada, the Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, do the trends differ? And do their views on the threat of French language, on immigration, do Francophones outside of Quebec have a different trend line than their English counterparts? Thank you.
So just on the first, and then I'll let, so Sonia Lebel was we'll see if she's still the minister for the Francophonie, but is really one of the person that Legault trusts the most. So I'm not privy to how they operate, but I would assume that he really lets her handle the file and that he doesn't really get involved in it at all, just because of the relationship he has with her and how he's really talked her up even during the campaign. He was always talking about Sonia as being like one of his main leaders in the caucus. So.
On the second point, the best answer I can. Oh, I thought I've got to take Anna's question. We're going to take them both, but we'll take Anna's question right after this. The main difference is that Francophones outside Quebec would not see the position of the French language in Quebec as threatened, but they would obviously see the position of the French language outside Quebec as threatened. So there's a sense of the Francophone minority outside Quebec would essentially say the French Quebecers don't know how good they've got it, and that's in a fairly kind of intuitive way that makes intuitive sense. And then they also have very different opinions of the federal government, right? And the Francophone minorities would be among the strongest constituency for an activist federal government in Canada, very different from Francophones in Quebec. Yeah, Anna.
sitting between you and the cocktail. I just actually I'm coming back from Ottawa from a conference of the chefs and go, de la francophonie. And it's very interesting. I heard a lot of comments about the results of the election, and I wanted to have your reaction about the fact that 40% of the vote has defined 75% of the seats, if my math is correct. So isn't this a bit of an aberration for democracy? And how will the Quebecers, react?
I mean,
I think everyone agrees that it's an aberration, but like, I think we're already past that. Like, it was the discourse over the first week, especially the fact that, like, for instance, the Conservative Party, which I think in my mind, that was actually, it was, yeah, it keeps moving.
Yeah, that's me.
Everyone agreed that it made no sense that the Conservative Party, even though they disagreed deeply with everything the Conservative Party was presenting during the election, that it got close. I think it's 14. I never remember it's 14, 15 or 13 because they all got almost the same thing, but and didn't get a single seat. Like that, those voices are not represented in the national. All parties except the CAQ government agreed that it did not make any sense, and every party except the Liberals and the CAQ talked about a change to the electoral system. But that happens all the time. There's some, again, discrepancies or large discrepancies between percentage popular vote and seats, and then we move on. And if the past is an indication, we've moved on, and that was it.
I mean, all I would say is if we got past the 1993 federal election and didn't change the electoral system, there's no result that's going to be more an aberration, than the one party finishing with 2 seats and one party getting 54 seats in official opposition, and then having relatively the same votes. That didn't spark us to change. So I can't, New Brunswick got a government with 100% of the seats, and it didn't spark any change. So the change of the electoral system has to come from a continual debate about these things, but there's no one result that's going to do, because we've already had the most, we've already had crazy results that are completely twisted, and nothing happened. So it's not the result that's going to do it. It's someone's got to figure out a way to convince people, right, based on the experiences we already had. Okay, we're going to wrap up on, are we optimistic or pessimistic given the nature of political debate? I'm happy to have the last word on that, but.
Okay, I'll have the first then. I think we are entering an interesting phase, and we've talked about Quebec, but Alberta, Saskatchewan. I think we're entering after what, I don't know how many years without like actual constitutional discussion, but we're actually entering a phase, I think, where some these maybe not to the extent that we did in the 80s and early 90s, but we are entering an interesting moment. Again, we'll see if Daniel Smith wins the next election in Alberta, but Saskatchewan yesterday launched a white paper on Saskatchewan autonomy called Drawing the Line, with its own demands on Ottawa. So again, to repeat myself, I think we're entering an interesting moment. I also think that the Canadian Federation is capable of adaptation. It has adapted in the past. I believe it might have to adapt again. I don't know in what shape or form, but I think it can. And so I think that puts me in the optimistic group, but I do think that there is some level of turmoil, difficult to pronounce, ahead.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost a crime in Canada to say you're not optimistic. It's like a cultural thing in North America where if you're not optimistic, there's something wrong with you. And then if you're in Europe, it's the other way around, right? So so I'm going to go with pessimistic just to make the point that we can have like free speech about pessimism in Canada, and it's a thing that's allowed. I will say what makes me pessimistic at time is how what I was saying earlier about we're trying to tackle 21st century problem with 19th century structures. It's true on the impact of social media on our democracy in the way that no single national government is equipped to deal with Facebook, it seems, and all that, and how it had a huge an effect already on the Quebec election, with the conservative movement being fueled a lot of the time in specific context of Éric Duhaime with conspiracy theories, anti-vaxxers and whatnot, that played a very big role in his movement and his popularity. And we can't just ignore that and think that it's going to go away if we don't change the structures in which we're having public debate more and more. And when I'm looking at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in South America, I'm seeing that the threats to democracy are real. And it feels like, I don't know, we believe that Canada cannot have issue, and then we pretend we're always surprised and when they do happen. And I think we need to be a little bit more prepared than that, and maybe a healthy dose of pessimism helps us see the threats as they come along and actually address them, and not be surprised when there's a convoy that takes over the capital and be like, oh, far right, we have that in Canada. Like, no, we do. Like so we do. So I think that's a healthy dose of pessimism that I will put in there, is that there are a lot of changes, pressures that are put on democracies around the world, including here. And we can't pretend that Canada is just isolated from all of that. And that everything's going to go well. I think if things go well, it's because we know that they can go wrong, and then we focus on that. And and once again, that's not just a Quebec conversation. That's an all over Canada conversation. Good luck with people in Alberta, by the way, with your new premier as well. And so it's just really not just a Quebec thing, and not just an Alberta thing either. And I feel like we need to know that to prepare for the worst, to be able to actually stir this in the right direction.
I'm an optimist by nature, but I'll close on this. I think there's a risk. I have a more narrow comment than you do, but I think there's a risk that with the fading away of the PQ, and therefore the fading away of a short-term constitutional crisis, that there's a risk that other political leaders in Canada think that they can kick around Quebec now and there's no consequences anymore. And I think that's a big mistake. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is, what if we all went to bed one night and woke up in the morning and found out that Doug Ford was the guy who could save the country? Because if there is a court decision around Bill 21, one of the most important players in this, in terms of setting the tone for the election, will be the Premier of Ontario. And I can't resist saying this because I see my friends in the room. There are those in the room who have, for over 50 years, been thinking about how Ontario can play the role of calming things down and keeping the dialogue open, and I don't think that role is done yet. Thank you very much, Emily and Charles, for coming. Thanks to everyone. And thank you all for coming here. There is a reception for those who can stay.